let me ask you something. Because when you look at cases like Haley Busby, where a missing person case turns into a multi-state investigation with new laws and House bills, the question is not just what happened. It's how the system allowed it to happen in the first place.
And we're not here to assign blame or second-guess decisions. That's not how we approach cases. That's not the Casewalker method.
Not entirely. No. But when people follow a case, whether it's like, something local, something high profile, or even something they've been tracking for years, what do you think they're actually using to decide what they understand about how it happened? Because most of the time, what we see consistently is people relying on the outcome. An arrest gets made, a case goes to trial, a conviction comes back, or a case is labeled as closed. And once that happens, there's this assumption that everything important has been answered.
And that assumption makes sense, at least on the surface. Because the system is structured to look linear. Sometimes something happens, an investigation starts, evidence is collected, a case moves forward, and eventually there's an outcome. So people see movement, and they interpret that as progress. They see an outcome, and they interpret that as understanding.
Right. But those two things don't always line up. And that's the problem. Because outcomes aren't based on complete reconstruction. They're based on legal thresholds. What can be proven? What can be introduced? What meets the standard required at that stage of the process?
Which means there's a difference between what actually happened and what the system is able to establish. And once you start working through cases at the record level, that difference becomes very clear. Because this isn't something that shows up once. It shows up across multiple cases, different types of cases too, not just one category.
Right. Across this season, we looked at missing person investigations where there's no resolution, closed cases where there's an outcome, active cases where they're technically open, but they don't show visible movement. And then a case like Delphi, where you have an arrest, a full trial, and now an appellate review.
Completely different procedural stages, different timelines, different types of evidence, different outcomes. But when you evaluate them the same way, through the record, not the narrative, you start to see the same issue repeat. There's a gap
Between what people think the system is doing and what's actually happening inside the process. And that gap shows up in different ways. Sometimes it's delay. Sometimes it's missing or misunderstood information. Sometimes it's the system itself, operating exactly the way it's designed to, but not the way people think it does.
But the key takeaway is this isn't rare. This isn't isolated. It's a pattern, and if you're only looking at the outcome, you're going to miss it.
Which is why this episode matters, because we're not walking through a single case this time. We're stepping back. We're looking at the structure itself.
Process, and the specific points where cases start to break down, where investigations slow, where information gets misinterpreted, and where the system creates limits, whether people recognize them or not.
Because once you understand those points and you stop following the headlines, you start evaluating cases based on what the record is actually showing you.
So if that's the framework, then the only way to actually evaluate it is to step back and look at multiple cases the same way, not individually, not based on headlines, not based on outcome, but side by side.
Agreed. Because if you stay inside the one case, you can explain almost anything. You could say it was unique. You could say it was complex. You can say there were factors we just don't fully understand. And sometimes that is true. However, when you start lining cases up next to each other, that's when those explanations stop holding.
And that's exactly what we did this season. We didn't stay in one category. We looked at different types of cases at different stages and evaluated all of them using the same standard.
And when we did that, the difference in outcome became very clear, not just in terms of what happened, but in terms of how the cases moved, or in some cases, they did not. For example, you have cases like Ashley Morris Mullis, missing since 2013.
Over a decade. And for most of that time, no visible movement, no resolution until recently, when according to reporting out of WTHR, there was an arrest made involving an individual connected to her case, specifically related to the kidnapping of her child.
Which is significant. But even with that, there still has been no confirmed public reporting that she has been located. So the case sits in a very specific position. Movement without closure.
Then you have cases like Lauren Spearer, which have been ongoing for almost 15 years, missing since 2011. Now more than 14 years out, approaching 15 years this June, with no confirmed resolution. And despite national attention, ongoing advocacy, and continued investigative interest,
There's still no confirmed resolution, which places that case in a completely different category entirely, like long-term missing, with sustained attention, but no outcome. Then you have cases like Darian Burdine, who's been missing since 2013, and according to NamUs, her case is still listed as active, no confirmed recovery or documented resolution.
which is another version of the same pattern. Open, but not progressing in a way that public can see, leaving questions without answers.
We even looked at more recent cases as well this season, and our missing spotlights, like Ella Saylor. Ella has been missing since February of 2024, which is still early compared to the others, but currently sitting in that same category, active, with limited public information.
And that's where people start to assume time alone will move a case forward, which isn't always how it works. Then you have a different kind of outcome, like Haley Busby.
Haley was reported missing in early of 2026 and later located deceased.
Which on its own is a tragic resolution. But what followed is what makes that case different. Because according to reporting from multiple outlets, her case didn't stop at recovery.
No, it triggered a legislative response. Legislative action at the state level, which included laws focused on child safety and online protections. After covering all these missing cases, it was striking to see how a case could create that level of impact across the state, which is not something we see in most cases. Why some cases and not others? I know I can't say it for certain, but I know it raised questions. Why? That's a question worth asking.
So now you're not just looking at an outcome. You're looking at a case that extended beyond itself and affected the entire system. The reach this case had across Indiana, from northern to southern communities, with pink bows appearing across towns and visible support.
All the while, there are cases like Penelope McGowan, who was reported missing and later located safe.
Which is the outcome every case is working toward, but not the one most cases reach. Laying it all out, side by side, you're no longer looking at just one person, one family story or case anymore. You're looking at a range of outcomes. Long-term missing, recently missing, recovered deceased, active with movement, active without visible movement.
Different timelines, different conditions, different results. But the same question keeps coming up. What determines whether a case moves or it doesn't?
Because clearly, it's not just one thing. It's not just evidence. It's not just time. And it's not just effort.
There are specific points in the process where cases either gain traction or they start to slow down.
And those points exist, whether people recognize them or not. Inside the investigation, inside how information is handled.
And inside the system itself, as we try to better understand how a case actually moves, we have to look at those points directly, which is what we're going to break down next, starting with the investigation itself.
So starting at the investigation level, this is where the trajectory of a case is really set. And most of that happens early, not later.
Right. And that's one of the biggest misconceptions that people have. They think an investigation builds over time. Like you can always go back and always find something later. And in some cases you can. But in a lot of cases, what happens early determines what's even possible later.
Because the first hours, the first days, that's when everything is still intact. Evidence hasn't degraded. Witnesses are still available. Timelines are still fresh.
And that's not just observational. That's reflected in how investigations are actually structured, especially in missing person cases. There's a reason law enforcement treat that first 24 to 48 hours as critical, because that window is widely recognized as critical in missing persons investigations.
Which is why you see rapid response systems built around that window. Because once that time is lost, you're not just slowing down the case, you're losing opportunities.
And that doesn't mean someone made a mistake. Sometimes it's delayed reporting. Sometimes it's lack of resources. And sometimes it's just the reality of how fast something actually unfolds.
But the effect is the same either way.
Right.
Once that initial window closes, the investigation is no longer working with the same clarity.
And that's where people tend to misunderstand how evidence actually works. They assume if something wasn't found early, it can just be found later. And sometimes that's true, but a lot of the time, what wasn't captured early becomes significantly harder to recover, or even impossible.
Physical evidence degrades. Environments change. People move, relocate, or become unavailable.
And memory, which a lot of cases rely on, it doesn't always stay fixed. It actually shifts over time. Details blur, timelines compress.
Which means the longer a case goes without new information, the harder it becomes to move forward. Not because no one is working it, but because the available information has limits. And that's where you start to see difference between a case being open and a case actually progressing, because open is a status.
Progression is movement, and those are not always the same thing. You can have a case that's been open for years and still has no new leads, no new evidence, or any new direction.
And from the outside, that can look like nothing is happening. But from an investigative standpoint, it often means the case has reached its limitation. A point where, without something new, it doesn't move.
And that's exactly what you can see when you look back at cases like Spearer, Burdine, Mullis. For years before recent movement, different cases, same constraint, which is why time alone doesn't resolve a case.
And effort alone doesn't resolve a case. There has to be something new introduced into the investigation for it to move forward. And if that doesn't happen, the case holds where it is. And even when an investigation is moving, that doesn't mean the case is being understood correctly. Because the next point where things start to break down is information. So even when an investigation is moving, there's another layer that affects how a case is understood. And that's the information itself. What's publicly available versus what actually exists in the full record. And those two things are almost never the same.
This is a gap that most people don't realize, because what the public sees is usually very limited. The press releases, selected filings, and the media coverage. which are pieces of the case, not the full scope of it.
And the issue is, those pieces are often treated like they're complete or definitive, when in reality, they're not designed to be.
And this is where that misinterpretation starts. Not because people are trying to get it wrong, but because they're working with partial information, or they're not sure what they're actually looking at.
Exactly, because not all documents serve the same purpose. And if you don't understand that, it's very easy to read something incorrectly.
I think this season, when we talked about the probable cause affidavit, hopefully it helped people see how it's not just like a complete case file. It's a threshold document. It exists to establish probable cause for an arrest, not to lay out every piece of evidence in a case.
Same with how a motion isn't a conclusion. It's an argument. And an appellate brief is a claim of legal error, not a determination of fact. So when those documents are read without context, they start getting treated like they're establishing truth, when they're actually presenting positions.
I truly think that's where the shift starts to happen, because once people start building conclusions on incomplete or misunderstood information,
that turns into narrative, and narrative moves faster than the record, every time. Just look at any Facebook or Instagram post. The gap is filled with so many theories, opinions, because it fills in the gaps. It gives people something complete to follow, even when the underlying information isn't complete.
people crave the closure. And once a narrative takes hold, it becomes very difficult to separate it from the actual record.
And that's not just something we're seeing in cases. It's something we see more broadly in how people process information. A lot of people have heard of the Mandela effect.
Right. Well, honestly, I knew what it was. I just didn't know the name. But yeah, where groups of people remember something a certain way, even when that detail was never actually accurate. Like the Monopoly man's missing monocle.
Exactly. And while that gets talked about casually, there is actual research behind how this happens. Once a belief takes hold, new information doesn't always replace it.
It gets filtered through it.
Or reshaped to fit it, which is how people can become confident in details that were never confirmed in the record.
Which is honestly just another way psychology helps explain how people interpret cases, because we all try to connect what a case actually shows with what we think it shows. And from an investigative standpoint, that matters, because if information is being misread or taken out of context, then the conclusions built on that information are going to be off.
Even if the original information is accurate.
Exactly. The issue isn't always the data, it's the interpretation.
And that's something we've seen repeatedly across multiple cases, not just one.
Which brings us back to the same point. If you're not working from the full record, and you don't understand the function of what you're actually reading,
you're only seeing part of the case. And when both of these pieces are working, the investigation and the information,
there's still another layer that determines how a case actually plays out.
the system itself. So even if you have an investigation that's moved forward and information that's being interpreted correctly, there's still a final layer that determines how a case actually plays out. And that's the system itself.
Right, because at that point, the question isn't just what happened anymore. It becomes what can be actually proven.
And those are not the same thing.
Not even close. Because people tend to think of the legal process as a way to get to the full truth, but that's not what it's designed to do.
It's designed to meet specific legal standards.
Burden of proof, rules of evidence, procedural requirements.
And those standards determine what can be introduced, what can be challenged, and ultimately what a jury is allowed to consider.
So when a case actually goes to trial, what you're seeing is not the entire picture. You're seeing the portion of the case that meets those legal thresholds.
And that distinction matters because a trial outcome, whether it's a conviction or an acquittal, doesn't automatically mean every question has been answered.
It means the legal standard was either met or it wasn't.
Within the rules of that system.
And when we talk about that standard, beyond a reasonable doubt, that's not just a phrase people use, that is a constitutional requirement. Established by the U.S. Supreme Court in R.E. Winship 1970, defining the level of certainty required for a criminal conviction.
So at trial, the question isn't what most likely happened.
It's whether the evidence meets that standard.
And that's where a lot of expectations break because people are looking for certainty.
But the system doesn't work within that.
And that's where a lot of expectations break because people are looking for certainty.
But the system is working within proof.
And those are two different things.
And the same shift happens again when a case moves into appeal.
But at that point, the focus changes completely.
You're no longer evaluating what happened. You're evaluating whether the process was handled correctly.
Legal errors, procedural errors, constitutional questions.
Not factual innocence.
Which is one of the most misunderstood parts of the system.
So a case can go through trial, move into appeal, and still leave underlying questions unresolved, because that's not what the appellate process is designed to address.
And that's where the disconnect really shows up, because people expect the system at every stage to provide clarity.
But the system isn't built to answer every single question. It's built to operate within defined limits.
And those limits matter.
Because they directly affect what a case looks like from the outside.
And how it's interpreted.
So when you see an outcome, you have to understand what that outcome actually represents.
Not just what appears to represent.
Because without that, it's easy to assume the system answered everything.
When in reality, it may have only answered what it was designed to.
And when you take all three of those areas together,
investigations,
information,
and the system,
you start to see where cases actually slow down or stop moving entirely.
And more importantly, why.
And this is where all of that, the investigation, the information, the system, stops being structural and starts being real. Because when we go back through the cases we've actually covered, we're not talking about theory anymore. We're talking about actual people.
And we're not revisiting these generally. We're working from what's been documented through verified reporting, NamUs, NCMEC, and publicly available law enforcement records and updates as they stand right now.
Right. So when we say a case is open or unresolved, that's not a blanket statement. That's based on where each case actually sits. Take Ashley Morris Mullis, who's been missing from Muncie, Indiana since September 19th of 2013.
For years, there was no visible movement in that case, but according to reporting out of WTHR, there has now been an arrest, a woman taken into custody in connection with her disappearance.
Which matters, because it shows that even after a decade, a case can still have movement.
But at the same time, there's no confirmed public reporting of recovery.
So you have movement, but no resolution.
Exactly the kind of gap we've been talking about. Then you look at Darian Burdine, missing from Indianapolis since 2013.
According to NamUs, her case is still listed as active.
No confirmed recovery, no public resolution.
Which places it in that category we discussed earlier, open, but not progressing in a way the public can actually see. Lauren Spear, Bloomington, Indiana, missing since 2011, now more than 14 years out, approaching 15 this June, with no confirmed resolution. And based on recent reporting, her case still remains unresolved.
Family continues to advocate, law enforcement continues to treat it as active.
But there's still no confirmed resolution.
Which makes it one of the longest running cases we've discussed, with sustained attention but no outcome. Then you have Haley Busby, and this is where things shift.
Right, reported missing in early 2026, while she was later located deceased.
Which is already a tragic outcome but what followed is what makes this case different.
This is where this case becomes critical to understand because it didn't stop at recovery.
Based on public reporting and court-related developments, investigators identified an adult male connected to her disappearance, with indications of prior online communication and movement across state lines.
This immediately shifted the scope of the investigation, from a missing person investigation to something involving digital contact and multiple jurisdictions.
And that matters because those elements change how a case is investigated, how quickly it escalates, and what resources are brought in.
But it also raised a bigger question, not just what happened, but how something like this was able to happen in the first place.
And that's where this case moves beyond investigation into system response.
According to reporting from the Indiana Capitol Chronicle, WFYI, and other media outlets, her case directly influenced legislative action at the state level.
Laws focused on child safety, including online protections and preventative measures, were introduced and signed into law, including measures identified as HEA 1303 and HEA 1408.
And at a basic level, those changes are aimed at earlier intervention, particularly in situations involving online contact with minors,
including expanding alerting and response tools, designed to help identify and respond faster in cases involving vulnerable or at-risk individuals.
Which means this case didn't just result in an outcome, it resulted in a response.
And that's not something we see in most cases.
No, most cases end with the investigation. This one extended way beyond it and forced a broader response to what was exposed. Now we take a look at another missing spotlight that we covered this season, Ella Saylor. She's been missing since February 3rd of 2024 from Muncie, Indiana.
Information on her case remains limited, primarily law enforcement alerts and missing persons listings.
While no confirmed recovery, her case still remains active, and her family is actively present on Facebook, searching for answers.
Let's move to Andy Madison Wagner, missing from Evansville since 2022.
According to available databases and case listings, there have been no confirmed sightings since her disappearance.
Case remains open. Penelope McGowan reported missing from Plainfield, Indiana in February of 2026.
At the time of our original coverage, her case was listed as an active missing juvenile investigation.
And based on verified reporting following that episode, she was later located safe.
However, there have been no additional publicly released details regarding the circumstances of her disappearance or the recovery.
And Jacob Curry, 14 years old, reported missing April 1st, 2026 as of now, and is currently reflected through NCMEC listing and initial public alerts. No confirmed recovery has been publicly reported. The case remains active. And when you step back and look at all of these cases together, you're not looking at one story. You're looking at a range of outcomes. Long-term missing.
Recently missing, recovered deceased, active with movement.
Active without visible movement. Different timelines, same reality. Most of them are still waiting.
And that doesn't change when this episode ends, which is why we track them, not as segments, but as ongoing cases.
Based on verified information as it changes, because without that, it's easy for cases to disappear from attention. So when you take all of this together, the investigation, the information, and the system, it changes how you look at the case.
It has to. Because once you understand where those limitations are, you can't just rely on outcomes anymore. You have to evaluate how the case actually moved, where it slowed down, where something may have been missed, and what the system was actually designed to do versus what people expect it to do.
And that's where most of the disconnect happens.
Not in the case itself.
Which is why the approach matters. And moving forward, that approach doesn't change. If anything, it becomes more defined.
We're not working from assumptions. We're not relying on narrative, and we're not treating outcomes as the full answer without understanding how they were reached.
Because that's where things get missed.
And that's where cases often get misunderstood. So the standard stays the same.
Record first, context matters, process matters, and patterns matter. And that's what this season was built to show. Not just individual cases, but how cases function across different conditions, where they move,
and where they don't.
Because once you start looking at cases that way, you start seeing connections that aren't obvious at first. And not every case exists in isolation. Some patterns extend beyond a single investigation.
Across multiple events, multiple timelines, and even multiple outcomes.
And that's where we're going next.
Season 2 takes us to another state where those patterns don't just exist, they overlap.
Where multiple cases within the same environment raise the same types of questions we've been working through here.
And where understanding the structure becomes just as important as understanding the cases themselves. Because at that point, you're not just looking at one specific case, you're evaluating a system. This isn't about speculation.
It's about understanding how cases actually move.
And where they don't.
Based on the record.
Before we close tonight, we pause. Because while we've spent this episode examining how cases move through systems, there are cases right now still actively waiting for answers.
This week's missing person spotlight is Jessica Masker.
Jessica Masker was 32 years old when she was reported missing from Indianapolis, Indiana in April of 2014.
According to available reporting and missing persons databases, she was last seen on April 23, 2014, and has not been heard from since.
Her case has now been active for more than a decade, and with no confirmed recovery and no publicly identified suspect.
Family members have continued to search for answers and to keep attention on her case as the investigation remains open.
As of this recording, there has been no confirmed public update indicating that Jessica has been located.
If you have any information regarding this case, you are encouraged to contact the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department or submit a tip through available missing persons resources.
Case reference information and source material will be included in the episode description.
Because awareness matters and information matters.
A missing person remains missing until they are found, and visibility matters, and these cases don't end until there are answers. This has been
the Casewalker Chronicles,
and we hope you keep walking with us.